Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Alhamdulillah. Glad to be back. For those wondering, what the heck happened to this channel? Is it dead? No, it's not dead. Alhamdulillah, we're still here. We're still thriving. And for those who have recently subscribed, thank you so much. I noticed just like a couple months ago, I had like 100 subscribers. Now, alhamdulillah, we're at 700. So, platform's growing. Alhamdulillah, I'm really happy to see that. Today, I really wanted to have more of a podcast type format and just speak to you guys directly about something. The first thing I want to say is I think maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, but I think there is a genuine moment in your life where sometimes, as a result of global events, you realize that you can no longer afford to like live in your bubble where you like don't care about history or you don't care about politics, because oftentimes it is history, i.e., like all of the different events and all of the different philosophies and ideas that have led us up to our current reality, and it is politics, i.e., like the grouping up of different human beings who decide how to best implement certain ideas to, govern people and stuff like that. It's important to understand these things because these things genuinely have a role to play in how the world ends up moving forward because of the globalized world that we live in, and because like there's just so much uh, impact that the media can have on people and the way that they think, and then the way that people think uh, as a global consciousness can have so much impact on what is tolerated and what is not tolerated in various global events. I think it's very important that for all of us who genuinely um, want to see an end to the suffering of Palestinian people, that we really, really try to understand the root causes of what has led up to today and the situations and events that have led up to today, because um, it's sad that there isn't much engagement in like actual genuine conversations as much as there is just rapid fire debates. But despite that, it's important to still be able to have really clear salient points when you're talking to people, because those points have the potential to influence people's minds, and that matters, because it's the lack of education and it's the misinformation that is spread that ends up leading to the collective dehumanization of the Palestinian people and of any population where you're trying to, oppress them or do certain things that you would never accept onto yourself. The key way to be able to do that is to first dehumanize these people, that, well, they're not really the same as me because they XYZ, insert whatever reason, and then that it allows justification for you to do things that are absolutely terrible to them. So, for this reason, I think one of the key areas where everyone can help the Palestinian plight is through education, because I think it's through changing individual minds one at a time that we're able to actually make a dent in the global consciousness, and then we can start to shift the paradigm. Now, I want to transition to understanding the history. So, I'm not by any means an expert on Palestinian history. In fact, I kind of only went down the rabbit hole of research after October 7th because I was like, what exactly is all that is happening? Like, I need to understand this deeper. I don't want to have like a shallow understanding of the situation. And growing up, I always heard about Palestine. I had Palestinian friends, but I never really tried to deeply understand the Palestinian plight up until recently. And so, if you're watching this and you are Palestinian, or likely way more than I do, then please feel free to correct me or to add in a source that I didn't mention. But I'm gonna try to just focus on linking resources that I've personally been using to learn, and then just kind of
sharing some of the things that I found really interesting that I did learn that I feel like maybe you wouldn't necessarily hear about in mainstream media. So I think a couple of important things to understand are Zionism as a modern political movement, understanding the origins of that, understanding the Balfour Declaration itself, which I'll link a video that really does a good job of describing these two things. And then the video also discusses like the 1930s and the situations between Arabs and Jews within Palestine up until like 1948. And so you can get a lot of that information from the video that I'll link, the first video. And then the second video that I'll link is a documentary that talks about 1948 itself. And this is where I think it's absolutely critical that if you're watching this, if you take anything away, watch the documentary. The person who made it, the team who made it, they made a description under the video that said it took them a decade to make the documentary. And I believe them because there are actual interviews of uh, Zionist militia forces that were actually involved in 1948, like real people that were on the ground, and interviews of Palestinian refugees that were actually displaced from their homes within 1948, kind of recounting their stories, and you get a really good understanding of the psychology of the people that were actually involved at the time. And it does a really good job of pushing back on a lot of ideas that we often hear. Like one thing that I first heard, even in these like 10-15 minute videos that you watch online that like Israel Palestine explained in 10 minutes, like those kind of videos. Um, a lot of those, whenever they talk about the Nakba, it's always seen as like a natural consequence of the Arab Israeli War that started on May 15th, 1948. There's no mention of the fact that from 1947 up until May 14th, 1948, there were hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that were already displaced. I think, in fact, in the documentary, they quoted a number that was in already the hundreds of thousands. So you could say like one third to one half of the Nakba had already happened before any Arab states invaded. Another idea that's pushed back on within the documentary is the idea that Palestinians like voluntarily left because Arab states told them to do so. Uh, I think pretty much all historians agree that this didn't really happen. And it's actually that Palestinians either were forcibly expelled or what did happen oftentimes is that Palestinians were forced to leave out of the genuine fear of their lives, because the documentary talks about how after the Deir Yassin massacre, which happened in April 1948, in the collective consciousness of Palestinians, there was so much fear of what could happen when Zionist militia forces take over their villages, because the Deir Yassin massacre was absolutely brutal, and it spread not the fear of that spread not only throughout the people within Palestine, but also throughout the consciousness of the Arab world in general. Because of that, there was a lot of Palestinians that fled just due to the actual fear of what could potentially happen when militia forces get to their villages. And it's important to recognize that these people did expect to be able to return when they leave. Like nobody decides to flee their home out of fear of their life and then expect that they're just never going to return back to their home, right? And so that's why you have a lot of stories that you'll hear about Palestinians who like still hold the legal documents and the key to their home because they literally thought that they were going to be able to return back, but they weren't able to. They were denied the right to return after the Arab-Israeli war ended. So that's just another thing that's really interesting as well that I learned from the documentary, and it was just really good. Like overall, really solid. And I think it's very fair as well. It included a lot of uh, narratives of historians that were more sympathetic to the Palestinian plight and that were framing things in a certain way. And then it also included historians that were more sympathetic to the Zionist militia forces at the time, and they interpreted the events in a certain way as well. And it shares kind of what both historians have to say, and then it kind of gives conclusions about what you can definitely conclude from 1948, irrespective of whichever side of historians you tend to favor more. Okay, so then when it comes to 1948 onward, I'll link a video from Norman Finkelstein in which he talks about a lot of the events that have led up to the current situation. I'll link an interview that he did about 5 years ago, where he talked about a lot of the previous operations within Gaza, and he was like discussing a lot of the narratives around Gaza and whether or not they hold any academic merit or not. And he was going through human rights reports, and he talks about the siege on Gaza and how it's affected the population in a way in which you probably are not going to necessarily hear within mainstream media. And so I think it's a really solid video to check out for that reason. And then the final thing that I'm going to mention, which I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys have already seen, the Bassem Youssef interview with Piers Morgan was really, really good. Like, the first interview was just like, wow. And then the second interview, the 2 hour one, was also really solid. Like, I was really, really impressed by like Piers Morgan, like actually really listening to him, not really cutting him off, allowing Bassam to really talk uh, freely for an extended portion of time. And it was really a joy to listen to. But there's 2 points that Bassam mentioned in his first interview with Piers Morgan that I think are really, really important points. The first point that he mentions is the ineffectiveness of a collective punishment of the population of Gaza. If you just look at the previous operations within Gaza, as he highlights, and as you'll see in the video with Norman Finkelstein, the only thing that it really led to was just a much worse Gaza for the predominantly civilian population, and how at this point, it's just getting like hundreds of times worse because we have a million people plus that have been displaced from their homes. We have people that are crowding in UN shelters, hundreds and thousands of them. A lot of the shelters are UN schools by the organization like UNRWA. And I was looking at a report from them, and they reported that there have been multiple direct hits on their facilities, despite the fact that there is literally a UN flag being raised. There's a UN hostilities report, and the report explains that at this point, 60% of housing units within Gaza have either been destroyed or damaged. It says that 50% of the education facilities within Gaza have been hit. It says that half of the hospitals within Gaza are out of service now and no longer working. There was a report that came out that says that officially all telecommunications are down within Gaza, and so they're essentially cut off from the outside world. So there's displacement happening, and the areas that people are supposed to go to, there's still bombing happening. There was a bombing of a refugee camp. There's bombings of UN schools. There is cutting off of fuel to hospitals. I mean, like, what do you expect this population to do? You know, um, and at this point, it's just like, may Allah help them. Like, I really genuinely pray that something can happen to end this very soon, because it is just getting more and more dire. So to switch focus from Gaza to the West Bank for a second, the second point that Bassam Youssef makes is that if you look at the situation in the West Bank, where there is no Hamas, so this kind of gives you an understanding of what the situation of Palestinians would be if you take Hamas outside of the equation. And clearly, the situation still continues to get worse in the West Bank. And within the interview, Bassam Youssef asked, like, okay, well, what's the excuse for that? And Pierce didn't really have an answer, because really there is no good answer to that. The situation just straight up continues to get worse. Illegal settlements are increasing. There is arbitrary arrests in this thing called administrative detention, where they don't necessarily have to give you any actual trial or tell you the evidence for why you're being arrested. And administrative detention can get renewed every 6 months arbitrarily, so you can really just stay there and be stuck there. There are 3,000 Palestinians that are currently being held in administrative detention. Since October 7th, settler violence and raids by IDF soldiers have increased, which have led to 100 plus Palestinians being killed within the West Bank. And there's just so much coverage online on the settlements and the situation in the West Bank and the oppression that Palestinians face there. So I'm not really going to go too much into that. There are many like documentaries and videos you can watch. It's just open. It's just clear open oppression. Inshallah, it is through these efforts of rehumanization and education and combating misinformation that we can start to help the global consciousness to uh, empathize with the historic plight of the Palestinians and then the current plight that they are facing within Gaza and the West Bank. And when that happens, I believe there will be more of a rehumanization of Palestinians within the global consciousness. And I think that, inshallah, that will be able to help us create more genuine dialogue about whether or not the current policies that are in place within Gaza and the West Bank are actually helping lead to any long term solution, or whether or not they are just exacerbating the situation and adding fuel to an already raging fire, which is the historical devastation and destruction that these people have already faced. Okay, so now that we've discussed all of this stuff related to Palestine, I want to switch focus and talk about what we as onlookers can do about the situation. And besides, the most obvious, which is like direct help, protesting, donating, making dua, etc., those things have been extensively covered already. But I want to talk about more of like a psychology that we can start to develop to help us cope with, I think, a lot of the grief that many people are facing. Uh, Sheikh Umar Suleiman posted a video, I think it was a khutbah that he gave, where he talked about the idea of survivor's guilt, the idea of like why them, why not me, like how come they're suffering and I'm sitting here in my fancy home and I'm eating these nice meals, I don't deserve any of this kind of mentality and guilt that can really just absolutely destroy a person's soul, right? Because there's really nothing you can do about the situation and you just feel so helpless. Um, and I'll link the khutbah below because maybe you can get some insights from there that you won't be able to get here. But I did want to comment uh, on this survivor's guilt idea and just discuss kind of how I've been trying to like think about it and cope with it. Um, so I'm just gonna mention three quick points. The first one is remembering that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a decree, has a plan. He has already pre-written that everything that's happening was going to happen. And I say that to say that sometimes whenever we see, devastation and destruction in anywhere in the world, we can start to develop this like really like doomsday type of mentality and like, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, like we've completely lost control and we don't know what's happening. And we have to remember that in these moments, Allah is still in control. Allah's wisdom is still at play. Allah still has the potential for good in everything that He's placed within this earth. And we have to also remember that this conscious experience that we call life is a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Palestinians are facing a very heavy test. And inshallah, Allah will compensate them for every ounce of suffering that they experienced. But at the same time, our test here, uh, as onlookers within the West and other parts of the world, our test is not necessarily one of severe difficulty and loss of our homes and our livelihood, but it's a test of ease. And it's important for us to acknowledge and recognize that and not to let this survivor's guilt cause us to like throw away all the blessings we have and have this like mentality of like just being really negative about our blessings. But instead, we should acknowledge our blessings, acknowledge that, well, alhamdulillah, I'm not in that situation. And what I'm going to do with that blessing is I'm going to dedicate my life to making sure that my life is not just about my own selfish interests, but I'm going to try to contribute to the greater cause of justice, the greater cause of fighting oppression, the greater cause of caring about the truth and upholding the truth. These are all things that, yes, it's related to Palestine, but it's not limited to Palestine. Oppression and falsehood and the lack of justice, all of these things exist within your own sphere of influence, within your own life as well. And so it's important to try to pay attention to that as well. And that can try to help you cope with that grief, because it allows you to put that grief towards something that is actually productive and that is actually going to really serve you on the day you meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second thing that I want to say is I think there's a lot of just rage, frustration with the media, frustration with the fact that we see, children under the rubble clearly being killed, and yet a ceasefire has still not been in place. I think it's important to remember that this dunya was not created for true justice to take place. While we can say that, yes, we expect that everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is, of course, going to have a wisdom to it and there's the potential for good in it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that 100% clear justice is going to happen within this dunya. That's what the akhirah is for. And the people who are indiscriminately killing children will most definitely be held to account in the court of the akhirah. And we should remember that, and we should not forget that, because I think that that can help quell a lot of the feelings that we're having, that just amount of rage and frustration. You have to understand that Allah is seeing everything, and Allah is the most just, and Allah will uh, honor every single ounce of good that we do, and He will recognize every single ounce of sin that we do that we have not repented for. And so when Allah is the judge, there's really no reason to have this type of excessive rage, because we know that true justice, inshallah, maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, will be served. And I just realized I don't really have a third point, but the last thing I wanted to mention was an ayah from the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He won't change the condition of a people until they change that which is in themselves. And so this kind of relates back to honestly both of my points, which is that we cannot let the grief and the rage consume us, but we have to continue to be vigilant in trying to improve our own selves and continue to work within our own sphere of influence to uh, contribute to the overarching cause of truth and justice and fighting oppression in whatever way that we can. And in a world filled with grief, we should be souls that provide relief. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to implement what we've discussed, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow the people and the children of Palestine to become the future scholars, doctors, imams, qadis, engineers, lawyers, entrepreneurs, activists of the ummah and all of the world, to show the Muslims and all of humanity that these people are gems that were simply never given a chance to shine. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum. Till next time.